Imagine a place where every story ever told, every discovery ever made, every sacred scripture, every piece of wisdom from the farthest corners of the earth, all of it, was gathered into one sanctuary of knowledge, a temple not built for gods of stone or idols of gold, but for the greatest deity humanity has ever bowed to, the truth. This place was no myth. It existed, and it was called the Great Library of Alexandria. For centuries, scholars have whispered about its legendary shelves. Entire civilizations believed it once contained the sum of all human knowledge. Some claimed it housed over 500,000 scrolls. Others swore that it kept secret maps of undiscovered lands, lost plays of Sophocles. The true Gospels never included in the Bible medical practices centuries ahead of their time, and even devices that could have jump-started the Industrial Revolution 1,000 years earlier. And yet, what makes this story so haunting is that this greatest treasure in human history was lost. But before we grieve over what was destroyed, we must understand how it was born. The dream of a pharaoh. Our story begins in the 3rd century BCE in Egypt, after the death of Alexander the Great, whose empire stretched from Greece to India. The lands were divided among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy I Sota, took Egypt. His son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, inherited not only the throne, but also a dream to turn Alexandria into the beating heart of culture, knowledge, and trade. To him, conquering land was no longer enough. He wanted to conquer ideas. So he envisioned a library so vast, so all-encompassing, that no scroll on earth could remain outside its walls. It would be a monument to human curiosity itself. And so, the Library of Alexandria was born. The Museion, Temple of the Muses. But the library was more than just shelves and papyrus scrolls. It was built as part of the Museion, a temple dedicated to the 9 muses, the goddesses of art, history, poetry, and science. Think of it as the world's first research institute. Scholars lived there, studied there, dined together, debated, and taught. It wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of knowledge. Imagine Aristotle's Lyceum, but magnified 100-fold, with royal funding and the ambition of an empire. Residents of the Museion were paid stipends, received free meals, and lived tax-free. They had laboratories, lecture halls, botanical gardens, and even dissecting rooms for medical study. In many ways, it resembled a modern university campus created more than 2,000 years ago. The scroll hunters. But how do you fill a library that aims to hold all human knowledge? The Ptolemies had a strategy both brilliant and ruthless. They sent out agents, scroll hunters, to the ports, markets, and academies of the ancient world. Ships that docked at Alexandria were searched, and every manuscript on board was seized, copied, and added to the library. The originals were kept in Alexandria, copies returned to the owners. Merchants from Greece, priests from India, astronomers from Babylon, mathematicians from Syracuse. If you carried scrolls, Alexandria would take them. Knowledge was treated as treasure, and treasure belonged to the pharaoh. Over time, Alexandria became the intellectual crossroads of the world. What did the library hold? Here lies the most tantalizing mystery. No catalog survives. We don't know exactly what scrolls were inside, but historians and fragments of writings give us clues. Mathematics, works of Euclid, who taught geometry in Alexandria, Archimedes' theories of mechanics, levers, and water displacement, lost texts on algebra from Babylon, medicine, the writings of Herophilos, who dissected human bodies centuries before Europeans dared to. Detailed studies on the nervous system, the heart, and the brain. Astronomy. Star charts from Mesopotamia, Egyptian calendars, Greek theories of planetary motion. Some claim the heliocentric model, that the Earth revolves around the Sun, existed in those scrolls long before Copernicus. Religion, sacred texts from Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and early Christianity. Stories that could have rewritten the Bible. Entire Gospels that were later declared heresy. Geography and exploration. Maps of Africa, Asia, and possibly even pre-Columbian America. Records of trade with India and China. Inventions and machines. Hero of Alexandria later described a steam-powered device called the Aeolipile. Imagine if such technologies were refined in antiquity. If even a fraction of this knowledge survived, human history might have been unrecognizably different. Herophilos, the father of anatomy, one figure, embodies Alexandria's daring pursuit of truth. Herophilos of Chalcedon. Living in the city around 300 BCE, he became the first physician in recorded history to perform systematic human dissections. He discovered the optic nerve, described the brain as the seat of intelligence, while most thought it was the heart, and identified the difference between arteries and veins. Imagine, centuries before modern medicine, he was already mapping the nervous system. His findings were written in scrolls stored in the library. None of his original works survive today. What we know comes only from later references. How much more did he write? What cures did he already see but humanity forgot? The vision of universality. Unlike most kingdoms, which hoarded knowledge for the elite, the Library of Alexandria sought universality. Ptolemy II wasn't trying to keep wisdom locked away. His dream was to collect and preserve everything for all time. There was even an ambition to translate works into Greek so that Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and Indian knowledge could merge into one universal language. In a way, Alexandria was humanity's first attempt at globalization of ideas. This was the dream, a place where truth, science, poetry, and religion all lived side by side, where physicians dissected bodies, poets performed in theaters, mathematicians debated with astronomers, and priests compared scriptures. The great Library of Alexandria was more than stone and papyrus. It was the memory of humanity itself. And yet, the brighter the flame of knowledge burns, the more shadows of fate gather around it. The city of Alexandria, a jewel by the sea. To understand the library, we must understand its city. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, Alexandria was more than just another coastal settlement in Egypt. It was designed as a cosmopolitan capital, a city meant to rival Athens in philosophy, Babylon in astronomy, and Thebes in religious majesty. It stretched along the Mediterranean, blessed with harbors that became the lifeline of trade between Africa, Europe, and Asia. Its streets were broad, laid out in grids like the Greek cities. Its centerpiece was the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships safely into the city's embrace. But if the lighthouse was a beacon for sailors, the library was a beacon for minds. A gathering of civilizations. Few places in history ever saw such diversity. Alexandria was where cultures collided and fused. Egyptians, bringing their millennia-old traditions, hieroglyphic records, and temple archives. Greeks, fresh from Alexander's conquests, carrying the legacy of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Babylonians and Persians, whose star charts and mathematical systems stretched back thousands of years. Indians, whose texts carried early concepts of zero, medicine, and spiritual philosophies. Jews, many of whom lived in Alexandria's thriving Jewish quarter, preserving and translating their scriptures. In Alexandria, a Jewish scholar could debate with a Greek mathematician while an Egyptian priest listened. A Babylonian astronomer might compare notes with an Indian merchant who carried knowledge of spices in distant lands. This city was not only a crossroads of goods, it was a crossroads of thought. The Great Translation Movement, one of the library's most ambitious projects, was the translation of the world's knowledge into Greek. The Ptolemies commissioned teams of translators to take sacred texts and scientific treatises from other cultures and make them accessible. Perhaps the most famous of these was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible created in Alexandria for the city's Jewish community. Imagine, in one hall of the library, scribes bent over papyrus, carefully copying scriptures in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. In another, scholars debated Indian philosophical texts or Egyptian astronomical calculations. This effort didn't just preserve knowledge, it merged it. A Greek philosopher could now access Indian medicine. A Jewish scholar could study Egyptian astronomy. A physician could cross-reference Babylonian herbal remedies with Greek surgical practices. The library became a universal language of wisdom. The scholars of Alexandria, the library wasn't just a storehouse. It was a living mind. Some of the greatest thinkers of antiquity either studied there or had their works preserved within its walls. Euclid, the father of geometry, whose principles still shape mathematics today. Archimedes, who calculated pi, built war machines, and envisioned mechanics that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. Eratosthenes, who measured the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy using only shadows and mathematics. Centuries before Columbus, Herophilos dissecting human bodies and describing the nervous system in a way Europe wouldn't catch up to until the Renaissance. Callimachus, the poet-scholar who is credited with creating the first library catalog system, the Pinakes. Imagine an ancient Dewey Decimal System guiding scholars to the right scrolls. These weren't just names. They were the building blocks of human progress. Knowledge as power, but knowledge in Alexandria wasn't just academic, it was also political. The Ptolemies knew that knowledge was a weapon as powerful as any army. By collecting the wisdom of nations, Egypt strengthened its prestige. Foreign scholars who wished to learn were drawn to Alexandria, binding their loyalty to the pharaoh who funded their studies. Think of it. Whoever controlled the library controlled the flow of truth. Whoever held the scrolls of medicine, astronomy, and engineering held the keys to the future. The library wasn't just about enlightenment. It was also about power. The ritual of seizing scrolls. One of the library's most infamous practices was its aggressive pursuit of manuscripts. Ships docking at Alexandria were searched by royal decree. Any book, scroll, or manuscript found on board was confiscated, copied, and kept. Owners were given replicas, while the original stayed in the library's vaults. This earned the library both admiration and resentment. Some praised the Ptolemies for preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost. Others accused them of theft, intellectual piracy on a global scale. Yet it worked. The library swelled to perhaps 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, though estimates vary. To put this in perspective, if even 400,000 scrolls survived, that's more than the entire surviving body of Greek literature we have today. Mini-story, Eratosthenes and the Size of the Earth. Among the library's many brilliant moments, one stands out. In 240 BCE, the scholar Eratosthenes made a discovery so profound it still amazes us today. He noticed that at noon in Syene, modern Aswan, the sun shone directly overhead at the summer solstice, reflected straight down a well. But in Alexandria, 800 kilometers north, the sun cast a shadow. By measuring the angle of the shadow and the distance between the two cities, he calculated the circumference of the earth. His estimate? 39,375 kilometers. The actual circumference is 40,075 kilometers. He was off by less than 2%. This knowledge existed in Alexandria 2,000 years before the voyages of Magellan and Columbus. Now, pause and imagine. What if this knowledge hadn't been buried by time? Could humanity have circumnavigated the globe 1,000 years earlier? The fragility of papyrus. But even in its glory, the library was vulnerable. Scrolls were written on papyrus, a delicate material made from reeds of the Nile. It decayed in humidity, burned easily, and crumbled with age. Without constant copying and preservation, texts could vanish silently. To house so many scrolls, the library was said to have had multiple wings, reading halls, storage chambers, and even a daughter library in the Serapeum, a temple to the god Serapis. But for all its majesty, the library was a palace of paper in a world of fire, the shadow of jealousy. Not everyone admired Alexandria. Rival cities such as Pergamon sought to build their own libraries. A fierce competition arose. Pergamon, unable to import papyrus from Egypt, developed a new medium, parchment, made of animal skins. Ironically, this innovation, born from Egypt's attempt to monopolize papyrus, would outlast the library itself. This rivalry shows a critical truth. Even as Alexandria tried to preserve knowledge, knowledge was also a prize in the power struggles of kingdoms. Seeds of vulnerability. As the centuries passed, Alexandria's brilliance also sowed its dangers. Its wealth of knowledge made it a target during wars. Its cosmopolitan culture clashed with rising tides of nationalism and religious orthodoxy. Its dependence on royal patronage meant that shifts in politics could leave scholars vulnerable. The library was a flame burning too brightly, attracting moths of envy, zeal, and conquest. At its height, the great Library of Alexandria was not just a building, it was the mind of the ancient world made flesh. In its scrolls lay the secrets of medicine, the mysteries of the cosmos, the blueprints of machines, the poetry of lost civilizations, and scriptures that could have rewritten the faiths of billions. But history teaches us a cruel lesson. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow that follows. And as the library's collection grew, so too did the forces that would one day bring it down. The fragile balance of power. For centuries, the library thrived under the protection of the Ptolemies. But Egypt was never isolated. To the north, Rome was rising. To the east, kingdoms shifted with new empires. And within Egypt itself, unrest stirred between Greeks, Jews, and native Egyptians. Knowledge is powerful, but it does not shield you from politics. The library, though a temple to wisdom, was built inside a world ruled by ambition, armies, and emperors. The shadow of Rome, By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had conquered Greece. Greek culture flowed westward, but Rome was still young in philosophy and science. Many Roman generals and politicians admired Alexandria as a jewel of learning. Others, however, resented it as a rival. The Roman appetite was never satisfied. They wanted Egypt's grain, its wealth, its harbors, and perhaps its wisdom. To Rome, Alexandria was both a prize and a threat. This tension between Egypt and Rome would one day set fire to more than scrolls. Mini's story, Cleopatra's education. One figure who embodied the bridge between Alexandria's intellectual heritage and Roman politics was Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt. Unlike the sultry caricature later Roman historians painted, Cleopatra was a polyglot, speaking at least 9 languages. She was educated in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, very likely using scrolls and teachers linked to the library itself. Imagine the young Cleopatra, perhaps walking the colonnades of Alexandria, debating with scholars, learning statecraft not only from generals, but also from books. Her sharp intellect made her a formidable ruler, but it also meant that when Rome came knocking, the fate of the library would be tied to the fate of her throne. The first great threat, Julius Caesar's war. The year was 48 BCE. Julius Caesar, embroiled in the Roman civil war against Pompey, pursued his rival into Egypt. Pompey was assassinated upon arrival, but Caesar found himself caught in the political turmoil of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra, seeking to claim the throne against her brother Ptolemy XIII, formed her legendary alliance with Caesar. But in the chaos of battle, Caesar's forces set fire to ships in the harbor of Alexandria. The flames spread to the docks, warehouses, and nearby buildings. Ancient historians like Plutarch and Dio Cassius claim that this fire reached parts of the library. Others dispute whether the main halls were destroyed at this time or only smaller collections near the port. Regardless, the image lingers. Scrolls curling into ash, the first great wound in the body of knowledge. What was lost in Caesar's fire? If indeed thousands of scrolls perished in Caesar's flames, what knowledge might have vanished? Maps that could have revealed unknown continents, philosophical works challenging Rome's worldview, advanced medical texts that could have saved countless lives, religious scriptures that might have rewritten faith. One cannot help but wonder, did Caesar, brilliant strategist though he was, realize that in torching ships he may have also torched centuries of human progress? For him, it was a tactical move in a civil war. For humanity, it was the beginning of an irreplaceable tragedy. The daughter library at the Serapeum. Some scholars believe that even if the main library was damaged, its collections were vast and scattered. One such repository was the Serapeum, a temple to Serapis, which housed a daughter library. This location stored overflow scrolls and may have survived the initial fire. For a time, Alexandria's scholars rebuilt, recopied, and preserved what they could. But the Serapeum, too, would one day fall not to foreign armies, but to the zeal of religion, the clash of faith and knowledge. As centuries passed, Christianity rose from a persecuted sect to the official religion of Rome. This shift was seismic. Where once knowledge was revered in pagan temples, now anything tied to paganism was suspect. By the 4th century CE, Christian zealots saw the Serapeum not as a temple of learning, but as a shrine to false gods. In 391 CE, during the reign of Emperor Theodosius I, who outlawed pagan practices, the Serapeum was stormed and destroyed. If the daughter library still held scrolls at that time, they were lost in this wave of religious fury, and thus, bit by bit, the flame of knowledge flickered. Hypatia, the last philosopher of Alexandria. Amid this clash of faith and reason, one figure stands as a symbol of Alexandria's final intellectual brilliance, Hypatia. Born around 360 CE, she was a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer. She taught in Alexandria, drawing both pagans and Christians to her lectures. Her wisdom and independence made her revered by students, but resented by extremists. In 415 CE, Hypatia was brutally murdered by a Christian mob. Her death is often seen as the symbolic end of classical learning in Alexandria. Whatever embers of the library remained, the intellectual spirit of the city died with her. The myth of the Caliph Omar. Later Muslim historians claim that when the Arabs conquered Egypt in 642 CE, Caliph Omar ordered the burning of whatever remained of the library. The story goes that he declared, if the books agree with the Quran, they are redundant. If they disagree, they are heresy. Modern historians debate whether this tale is true or propaganda written centuries later. Regardless, it reflects a universal truth. Across history, knowledge has often been judged not by its truth, but by its alignment with power, the mystery of the loss. So what really happened? Did Caesar's fire annihilate the library? Did the Serapeum's destruction finish the job? Did Caliph Omar's conquest extinguish the last remnants? The truth is likely more complex. The library may not have died in one great blaze, but in slow decay, fires, neglect, censorship, and time itself eroding its treasures. What makes the story so haunting is not only what was lost, but that we will never know the full scope. It is a wound we cannot heal, because we do not even know how deep it was. Knowledge versus power, a universal struggle. The fall of the library reminds us of an eternal conflict, the tension between truth and authority. To rulers, knowledge was useful, but dangerous if uncontrolled. To religions, knowledge was holy, unless it contradicted dogma. To scholars, knowledge was sacred, but fragile. And so, century after century, scroll after scroll, the Library of Alexandria vanished, not in one night, but across generations. At its height, the great Library of Alexandria promised humanity a shortcut to the future. But history had other plans. Fires of war, storms of faith, and the indifference of time slowly consumed it. And yet, in imagining what was lost, we arrive at the heart of our great what if. For what if the library had survived? What if those scrolls had been preserved? What if humanity had leapt forward, not stumbled into darkness? That is the question we turn to next. The great what if now. We step across the threshold of history into speculation. We know the library existed. We know it collected wisdom from across the world. We know it burned, decayed, or was destroyed. But what if it hadn't? What if those scrolls survived, intact, protected, and passed down through the ages? This question is not fantasy. It's a blueprint of how different the story of humanity could have been. The destruction of the library wasn't just the loss of words on papyrus. It was the loss of centuries, maybe millennia, of human progress. A head start for science. Think of the discoveries we made in the last 500 years. The telescope, the microscope, the printing press, electricity, steam engines, vaccines, antibiotics, airplanes, rockets, computers. Now imagine if much of this knowledge had been hinted at, theorized, or even partly developed in ancient texts. We know some of it was. Hero of Alexandria described machines powered by steam pressure centuries before the Industrial Revolution. His work survived, but what if the library had preserved more? Imagine an industrial revolution in 200 BCE instead of 1750 CE. Medical texts from Herophilos describe the nervous system. What if detailed surgical procedures and anatomy were preserved? We might have cured diseases centuries earlier. Astronomical theories from Aristarchus suggested the Earth revolved around the Sun. With the library's records, heliocentrism could have become mainstream long before Copernicus. In short, the Dark Ages might never have happened. Religion in the light of knowledge. Religion shaped empires, wars, and civilizations. But what if the library had preserved rival gospels, lost scriptures, or Eastern spiritual texts? The Christian church might have been forced to reconcile with competing narratives from the very start. Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism could have merged more deeply, reshaping spiritual history. Islam, which emerged centuries later, might have risen in dialogue with a far more advanced scientific world. Would dogma have survived if knowledge had been universal? Or would religions have evolved into philosophies, less rigid and less prone to conflict? The political domino effect with advanced knowledge. Empires rise differently. Rome, armed with advanced engineering, could have expanded even further, or collapsed sooner under the burden of rapid technology. Medieval Europe might never have stagnated. Instead of knights and castles, the continent might have had machines, electricity, and scientific republics. Colonialism may have unfolded differently. Africa and Asia, armed with their own preserved texts in the library, might have resisted European domination with equal or superior technology. This one ripple, the survival of scrolls, could have shifted the balance of power across continents. Mini story, the steam engine that never was considered again. Hero of Alexandria's Aeolipile, a device where steam escaping from a sphere caused it to spin. To us, it looks like a primitive toy, but it was the seed of the steam engine. Why didn't it spark an industrial revolution? Because Hero lived in a world where slaves provided cheap labor. There was no economic push to develop machines. But what if? What if Hero's designs were preserved, studied, and improved upon by generations of inventors? By 200 CE, Rome might have had steam-powered factories. By 500 CE, locomotives. By 1000 CE, intercontinental ships powered by engines. By 1500 CE, flight. Instead, humanity waited 1,500 years to rediscover the power of steam, medicine, and human life. Another chilling loss was in medicine. Herophilos and Erasistratus, working in Alexandria, dissected humans and described organs in detail. They may have written hundreds of scrolls on surgery, neurology, and physiology. If those texts had survived, anesthesia and surgical techniques could have advanced by the Middle Ages. Vaccination-like practices might have emerged centuries before Edward Jenner. Epidemics like the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, might have been prevented, saving millions of lives. Imagine Europe never losing one-third of its population to plague. Imagine Africa and Asia better armed against smallpox, measles, and influenza when Europeans arrived. The health of humanity itself could have been radically different. The technological butterfly effect. The survival of knowledge accelerates everything. If we had discovered electricity in 500 CE, computers might exist by 1200 CE, rockets by 1400 CE, interplanetary travel by 1600 CE. Think of this. Galileo discovered Jupiter's moons in 1610. If the library preserved advanced Babylonian or Indian star charts, that discovery might have come 1,500 years earlier. The Wright brothers flew in 1903. With preserved texts on mechanics, flight might have occurred in 300 CE, space exploration, nuclear power, quantum physics, all could have been medieval achievements. We might not just be on Earth today, we might already be a multiplanetary species. The human mind unleashed. But the greatest impact may not have been on machines or medicine, it may have been on us. Knowledge changes how humans see themselves. Instead of centuries of superstition and fear, we might have had centuries of rational thought. Instead of burning witches, societies might have embraced science. Instead of silencing dissent, rulers might have built empires on reason. Would wars of religion have even happened if knowledge had already made the heavens less mysterious? Would slavery have persisted if machines had replaced human labor early on? Perhaps the library's survival could have given us a world less cruel, less ignorant, less divided. The dark possibility, yet not all outcomes are golden. Knowledge in the wrong hands is dangerous. Imagine Rome with cannons in 100 CE. The empire might have become unstoppable, crushing diversity. Imagine medieval warlords with chemical weapons. Knowledge might have meant faster destruction, not peace. Imagine powerful religions using science not to enlighten, but to enforce dogma with advanced tools of control. The library's survival could have brought a utopia or a nightmare. Mini story. The lost Gospels, among the most intriguing theories, is that the library housed early Christian writings that never made it into the Bible, perhaps even texts suppressed by the church centuries later. What if these Gospels survived? What if they showed a radically different vision of Jesus? Not as a divine Son of God, but as a wise teacher, a philosopher among many? Christianity as we know it may never have taken the same form. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the Reformation, all of these might have been avoided in a world where Scripture was open to debate from the start. In that alternate timeline, the Library of Alexandria wouldn't just have saved science, it might have reshaped faith itself. The most haunting question. And so we arrive at the heart of the matter. Was humanity robbed of its rightful destiny? Did the flames of war and zealotry cost us a future where the stars were ours by the year 1000? Did we lose cures, philosophies, and wisdom that could have saved billions of lives? Or was the destruction inevitable? Was humanity simply not ready for such a leap? The truth may never be known, but the question lingers, like smoke rising from ancient scrolls. What if the Library of Alexandria had survived? With this, we stand between history and imagination. On one side, the facts of fire, loss, and silence. On the other, the dazzling dream of what could have been. This what if is not just about books or scrolls. It is about the destiny of humanity itself. The library is gone, but in dreaming of it, we glimpse the greatness we might still yet achieve. The long echo of silence. When the last scrolls of the library crumbled into dust or burned into smoke, humanity didn't just lose books, It lost centuries of memory. It is difficult for us, living in a world of instant information, to imagine what that silence meant. Today, a single smartphone can access more knowledge than all the kings of antiquity combined. But for much of history, knowledge was fragile. One fire could erase generations. One zealot could silence 1,000 voices. The great Library of Alexandria is remembered not for what it gave us, but for what it took away when it vanished. It became a symbol of absence, a ghostly reminder that human progress is not guaranteed. What we still have, though the library is gone, fragments survived. Euclid's Elements still teaches geometry today. Archimedes' writings, though many lost, still revealed genius in mathematics and engineering. The Septuagint remains a cornerstone of biblical scholarship. Ancient star charts and calendars still whisper the observations of forgotten astronomers. But these are only the crumbs of a feast. For every text that survived, hundreds may have been lost. The tragedy is not that we lack wisdom today. It is that we will never know what we could have had centuries earlier. The library, as a myth over time, the Library of Alexandria, became more than a historical site. It became a myth of lost potential. Writers and philosophers invoked it as the ultimate tragedy of civilization. To some, it symbolized the arrogance of empire, building a monument so great, yet failing to protect it. To others, it was proof that ignorance and zealotry are humanity's greatest enemies. The myth grew larger than the reality. Perhaps the library never held as many scrolls as legend claims. Perhaps much of its content was mundane. But the idea that humanity once held its entire memory in one place and lost it burns brighter than any fact. The fragility of knowledge. The story of the library is also the story of fragility. Knowledge, unlike stone monuments, can vanish quietly. A temple may stand for thousands of years, but an idea can be erased in a moment if its words are lost. This is why civilizations invented ways to preserve memory: oral traditions, written records, printed books, and now digital archives. Yet even today we are not immune. A solar flare, a global catastrophe, or even digital decay could wipe out entire libraries of data. The lesson of Alexandria is not just about the past. It is about the responsibility of the present. The new Alexandria. In 2002, Egypt inaugurated the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a modern library built near the ancient site. Its architecture evokes the rising sun, symbolizing enlightenment. Inside, millions of books and digital archives are preserved. It is a tribute to the dream of universality. But can it ever replace what was lost? The ancient library's scrolls are gone forever, and yet the modern library carries forward the spirit of preservation, a reminder that knowledge must be guarded as fiercely as treasure. Mini story: Carl Sagan and the cosmic tragedy. The astronomer Carl Sagan once reflected on the library's destruction, calling it the greatest intellectual catastrophe in history. He imagined ancient scientists building machines, exploring the stars, or eradicating disease centuries before us. He mourned not only the loss of knowledge, but the loss of time, centuries during which humanity wandered in ignorance when it could have soared. Sagan's reflection reminds us the tragedy of the library is not just about books. It is about billions of lives that might have been lived differently had wisdom arrived earlier. The legacy of the what if. And so, as we close this first chapter, we stand at the crossroads of memory and imagination. The Library of Alexandria teaches us 3 lessons. Knowledge is power, but also fragile. Empires fall, temples burn, and ideas vanish unless preserved. Progress is not inevitable. Humanity does not always march forward. Sometimes we stumble, sometimes we fall, and sometimes we forget. What ifs matter. By imagining what might have been, we sharpen our vision of what could still be. Reflection, the greatest treasure. Ask yourself, what is the greatest treasure in the world? Gold, silver, diamonds, power? Number. The greatest treasure is memory, humanity's accumulated wisdom. A single scroll in Alexandria, perhaps describing the cure for infection or the orbit of planets, was worth more than any jewel-encrusted crown. And yet, we let it burn. This is why the library still haunts us. It is not just about what we lost, but what we failed to protect. Bridge into Chapter 2. As we leave behind the founding, flourishing, and destruction of the library, we enter a new journey, the speculation of history. In Chapter 2, we will dive deeper into the destruction itself, the fires of Caesar, the zeal of Christian mobs, the myths of Muslim conquest. We will examine not just what happened, but why it happened, and how it reflects the eternal conflict between knowledge and power. The story of Alexandria does not end in its walls. It lives on in the wars of ideas, the struggles of empires, and the choices we face even today. The great Library of Alexandria was humanity's first attempt to build a memory that belonged not to one people, but to all people. It was a bold dream, that truth could be gathered, preserved, and shared across nations. That dream burned, but its smoke rose into the skies, carrying with it the greatest what if in history. A question that echoes across centuries. What if the Library of Alexandria had survived? Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria, 48 BCE. It was the winter of 48 BCE. The Mediterranean world trembled under the weight of civil war. Rome, once unified, had split between two titans, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Pompey fled to Egypt after his defeat at Pharsalus, seeking refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, who was locked in his own power struggle with his sister, Cleopatra VII. But instead of sanctuary, Pompey found betrayal. Stabbed on the shores of Egypt by courtiers eager to impress Caesar. When Caesar arrived, he was horrified at Pompey's murder, yet his shock soon gave way to ambition. He became entangled in Egypt's dynastic crisis, siding with Cleopatra in her bid to reclaim the throne. What followed was a fierce conflict in the streets and harbors of Alexandria, and it was during this chaos that the first great fire, a blaze that would forever stain human history, was lit. The spark in the harbor. Ancient sources tell us that as Caesar fought Ptolemy's forces, he ordered the burning of Egyptian ships in Alexandria's harbor. The tactic was meant to prevent enemy fleets from surrounding him, but fire, once unleashed, is a beast beyond command. The flames leapt from ship to dock, from dock to warehouse, from warehouse to city. The Roman historian Plutarch wrote that the fire spread into the great library. Cassius Dio echoed the claim, noting that many books were lost, but other accounts are less certain. Some suggest the main library was untouched, while only storehouses near the harbor perished. Still, imagine the scene. Smoke rising like a black storm over the Pharos lighthouse, scrolls curling into ash as flames devoured papyrus, scholars fleeing in despair. Whether the main halls were lost or not, the image of fire-consuming knowledge became etched into history. What was lost? If the library's scrolls were indeed consumed, then the scale of loss was staggering. Some accounts speak of 40,000 manuscripts destroyed, others of 400,000. But numbers are abstractions. Picture instead the contents: a Babylonian astronomer's record of eclipses, stretching back thousands of years; a Greek playwright's final trilogy, never performed outside his homeland; an Indian physician's text on surgery, forgotten before Europe learned to wash wounds; maps showing trade routes across Africa, Arabia, and Asia. Each scroll was not just ink on papyrus, it was a voice silenced forever. The fires debate. Historians still argue about the extent of the damage. Did Caesar's fire destroy the main library, or only storage depots where scrolls were kept temporarily? Was the loss partial or total? Did scholars salvage texts and move them to the Serapeum? Was this the beginning of the end, or only a wound the library could have recovered from? The truth is blurred, but the symbolism is undeniable. In that moment, war silenced wisdom. A general's torch outweighed the voices of centuries. Cleopatra and Caesar, love amidst ashes. And yet, while flames licked Alexandria, another fire was kindled. Caesar's alliance with Cleopatra soon turned into romance. Cleopatra, brilliant and ambitious, understood the value of knowledge as much as power. Some legends claim she sought to restore what was lost, gathering texts from around the world to replenish the library. If true, it suggests that even amid destruction, the dream of Alexandria endured. Imagine Cleopatra and Caesar walking the colonnades, smoke still in the air, as she vowed to rebuild. For her, the library was not just Egypt's treasure. It was a tool to elevate her reign, to outshine rivals, to make Alexandria the eternal jewel of the world. But destiny rarely grants second chances. Mini story: the Scroll of Aristotle. One tale, half history, half legend, suggests that among the scrolls lost may have been Aristotle's works on drama, physics, and politics, compiled by his successors. Had those manuscripts survived in full, our understanding of philosophy might have leapt ahead by centuries. Instead, we have only fragments. Imagine the frustration, knowing that the greatest mind of Greece may have written truths we can never read. Caesar's victory, humanity's defeat. In the end, Caesar won. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra was crowned queen, and Rome's influence in Egypt deepened. For Caesar, the fire was a tactical inconvenience, collateral damage in a war he needed to win. For humanity, it may have been the first great intellectual catastrophe. And yet, the library survived in some form. Scrolls remained. Scholars continued their work, and the Serapeum still stood. The fire was not the end, but it was a warning. Knowledge, no matter how grand, could fall victim to politics. The echo of the first flames. Why does this moment linger in memory? Because it shows how fragile wisdom is. All it takes is one war, one order, one careless fire. We often imagine progress as inevitable, but the library reminds us that history is not a straight line. It can be broken, twisted, set ablaze. Caesar's torch lit more than ships. It lit the long shadow of loss. Thus ends the first act of destruction. In the clash between empire and dynasty, knowledge was the true casualty. The fire of 48 BCE may not have ended the library outright, but it began the slow unraveling. And this was only the beginning. Greater storms of faith and politics still loomed. The second great blow would not come from Rome's generals, but from Rome's priests. The library after the flames. When Caesar left Egypt in triumph, Alexandria bore scars. Ships lay in charred ruin, warehouses smoldered, and whispers of lost scrolls haunted scholars. Yet the library was not dead. If Caesar's fire reached the collections, it wounded rather than destroyed. For centuries after, Alexandria remained a beacon of scholarship. The dream of universal knowledge lived on. It was rebuilt, replenished, and in many ways strengthened. New scrolls were sought, copied, and stored. The Serapeum, the daughter library, became a vital reservoir. The intellectual heartbeat of the city still pulsed, though it beat more cautiously now, aware of its fragility. The Serapeum, the guardian of scrolls. The Serapeum of Alexandria, a grand temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, became one of the library's most important branches. Built on the city's Acropolis, it towered above Alexandria, a spiritual and scholarly refuge. Here, thousands of scrolls were housed, possibly those rescued after Caesar's fire or new acquisitions gathered by the Ptolemies. Unlike the main library near the Mausoleum, the Serapeum was a temple first, library second. This blending of faith and wisdom gave it both protection and danger. Inside its halls, priests performed rituals to Serapis, while scribes catalogued and copied scrolls. It was a symbol of Alexandria's unique character, a city where gods and ideas shared the same roof. But as centuries would show, temples are vulnerable to zealotry, the rivalry of Pergamon. While Alexandria rebuilt, another city rose to challenge its supremacy, Pergamon in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. The Attalid kings of Pergamon envied Alexandria's prestige. They began assembling their own massive library, determined to rival the Ptolemies. According to legend, the rivalry was so intense that Ptolemy V banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon, attempting to cripple their efforts. Deprived of papyrus, Pergamon innovated. They perfected parchment, animal skins treated into durable writing surfaces. This technology, born of rivalry, outlasted papyrus by centuries. While Alexandria's scrolls crumbled in fire and humidity, Pergamon's parchments survived into medieval monasteries. Ironically, the attempt to preserve Alexandria's dominance created the very medium that would eclipse it. Mini-story: the 200,000 scrolls. Gift one tale, though debated, claims that Mark Antony, during his love affair with Cleopatra, gifted her the entire library of Pergamon, 200,000 scrolls, to replenish Alexandria's collection after Caesar's fire. If true, this means that the rivalry of libraries ended in union, with Pergamon's treasure swelling Alexandria's vaults. Imagine Cleopatra walking through halls lined with new scrolls, each one a dowry from her Roman lover, each one a piece of humanity's puzzle restored. Whether myth or fact, the story symbolizes Alexandria's resilience. Even in loss, it absorbed knowledge from the world around it. The flow of knowledge continues, despite the scars of fire. The 1st and 2nd centuries CE saw Alexandria continue as an intellectual hub. Roman emperors, while wary of Egypt's independence, valued its grain and its scholars. The library, or what survived of it, still influenced great thinkers. Galen, the physician, studied in Alexandria, drawing on medical texts preserved there. His works would dominate European medicine for over 1,000 years. Plotinus, the philosopher, drew from Alexandria's intellectual melting pot to shape Neoplatonism. Astronomers and mathematicians continued refining ideas that bridged Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian traditions. Knowledge was not extinguished. It was wounded, patched, and carried forward. The flame flickered, but it still burned, the fragility beneath the surface. And yet, even as the scrolls multiplied again, danger loomed. The Roman Empire was not the Ptolemaic kingdom. Rome admired Greek learning, but its heart was military, not scholarly. Libraries in Rome served elites, not the universal dream of Alexandria. Egypt became a province, its independence stripped, its treasures subject to Roman governors. Religious tensions simmered as Jews, Greeks, and Egyptians clashed in Alexandria's crowded streets. The library existed, but it no longer stood under the protection of a king who dreamed of universal memory. It now lived at the mercy of emperors and mobs. Many story. The scrolls on the ships, a persistent legend tells of the Ptolemies ordering that every ship entering Alexandria surrender its manuscripts. These were copied, originals kept, and replicas returned. Now imagine after Caesar's fire, hundreds of ships arriving again, scrolls taken, scribes copying feverishly. The sea itself became a tributary of knowledge. Alexandria was still hungry, but this hunger, noble as it was, also painted a target on the library's back. To others, it looked like theft. To zealots, like heresy. To rulers, like power that must be controlled. The calm before the storm. The 2nd century CE might have seemed a golden age of recovery. The Serapeum thrived. Pergamon's rivalry enriched scholarship. Alexandria remained a jewel of learning. But beneath this calm, the world was changing. Rome was shifting from polytheism to a new faith, Christianity. And with that shift came suspicion toward anything pagan, anything rival, anything that did not fit the new order. The next flames would not come from foreign warlords, but from within, from Rome itself, turning its back on the very knowledge it once admired. After Caesar's siege, the library rose again. It rebuilt, absorbed rival collections, and continued to shape medicine, philosophy, and science. But it lived on borrowed time. The fire of war had scarred it. The fire of faith was yet to come. The next chapter of destruction would be darker, because it was not an accident of battle. It was an act of zeal. And when it came, it would strike not only the library's scrolls, but its very soul. The shift of empires. By the late 4th century CE, the Roman Empire had changed beyond recognition. Once the realm of Caesars and legions, Rome had now embraced a new master, Christianity. The Emperor Constantine's conversion in the early 300s opened the floodgates. By the reign of Theodosius I, 379 to 395 CE, Christianity was not merely tolerated, it was the official state religion. Pagan rituals were outlawed, temples closed, sacrifices banned. This was a turning point not only for faith, but for knowledge. For centuries, the library and the Serapeum had been tied to pagan traditions. They were temples as well as archives, dedicated to gods like Serapis and the Muses. Now, in a world where the cross replaced the eagle, these sites looked less like sanctuaries of wisdom and more like dens of heresy. The Serapeum, last bastion of knowledge. The Serapeum of Alexandria, standing tall on the city's Acropolis, had become the beating heart of what remained of the library's spirit. Thousands of scrolls likely rested in its chambers, guarded by priests of Serapis. For centuries, it had symbolized the unity of Greek and Egyptian culture, a place where knowledge and religion coexisted. But to Christian zealots, it was the enemy, a symbol of idolatry, a fortress of paganism. The tension was palpable. Scholars still studied in its halls, but mobs prowled outside. Alexandria, once a city of exchange, was now a city divided, Christian against pagan, zeal against reason. The Edict of Theodosius, 391 CE. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius issued an edict banning all pagan practices. Temples were to be closed, idols destroyed, sacrifices outlawed. For Christians, this was the triumph of truth over falsehood. For pagans, it was the end of their world. And for the Serapeum, it was a death sentence. When Alexandrian Christians, emboldened by imperial decree, moved against the temple, violence erupted. Pagan defenders barricaded themselves inside. The temple was besieged, its treasures looted, its scrolls scattered or burned. The Serapeum fell, not by accident, not by war, but by decree, a deliberate act of erasure. What was lost in the Serapeum? We cannot know the full scale. Some say the Serapeum still housed tens of thousands of scrolls, others that it had dwindled to a symbolic collection. But what we do know is this: whatever remained of the library's spirit, its last great refuge, was extinguished in that moment. Imagine shelves toppled, papyrus crushed beneath sandals, scrolls thrown into fire as chants of zeal filled the air. Imagine priests silenced, scribes scattered, and centuries of effort erased in one act of fury. Mini-story: the pagan refugees. Some accounts tell of pagan scholars fleeing Alexandria after the Serapeum's fall, carrying with them fragments of texts. They found shelter in distant lands: Athens, Antioch, Constantinople. Perhaps some scrolls survived this way, smuggled in satchels, copied in secrecy. Perhaps what we call lost is only partially lost. Echoes of Alexandria, preserved in the libraries of Byzantium or the monasteries of Europe. But these were fragments. The dream of universality, the idea that one place could hold all wisdom, died with the Serapeum. Hypatia. The last light. Out of this darkness rose a final figure of brilliance, Hypatia of Alexandria. Born around 360 CE, Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician and philosopher. She grew to surpass her father, teaching mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy in Alexandria. She was a woman in a world of men, a pagan in a city of Christians, a voice of reason in an age of zeal. Her lectures drew both pagans and Christians. She was admired by students, respected by city officials, and feared by rivals. For a time, she kept alive the spirit of Alexandria, the idea that wisdom belonged to all who sought it, but her very existence was a threat. The murder of Hypatia, 1415 CE. In 415 CE, political tensions between Alexandria's governor Orestes and its bishop Cyril erupted into violence. Hypatia, seen as Orestes' ally and a symbol of pagan philosophy, became the target of Christian mobs. One day, as she traveled through the streets, she was dragged from her chariot, stripped, beaten, and brutally killed. Some accounts say she was flayed alive with pottery shards, her body torn apart, her remains burned. With Hypatia's death, the last great philosopher of Alexandria fell. It was more than a murder. It was the symbolic death of classical learning in the city. Knowledge versus faith. The fall of the Serapeum and the murder of Hypatia were not just local tragedies. They marked a broader shift, the triumph of orthodoxy over inquiry. Christianity did preserve some knowledge in monasteries, in scriptoria, in translations, but it preserved selectively, discarding what it deemed dangerous or heretical. The universal ambition of Alexandria to preserve everything was replaced with preservation of only what aligned with doctrine. This narrowing of scope created what we now call the Dark Ages in Europe. Knowledge survived, but in chains. Science lingered in whispers, hidden in monasteries or carried eastward into the Islamic world, where it would later flourish. Mini-story, Augustine versus pagan wisdom. Around the same time, the Christian philosopher Augustine wrote The City of God, arguing that pagan learning was inferior to divine revelation. For him, scrolls filled with Greek philosophy mattered little compared to the Bible. His view reflected the age. Knowledge was no longer pursued for its own sake, but judged against faith. The library's dream, knowledge without borders, was incompatible with this new order. The legacy of Hypatia. Though she died in brutality, Hypatia's memory endured. To some, she became a martyr for science, reason, and women in philosophy. To others, she was a cautionary tale of what happens when knowledge confronts power. Her death symbolizes the second great blow to the library, not just the loss of scrolls, but the loss of spirit. Even if texts survived in scattered collections, the culture of open inquiry, the lifeblood of Alexandria, was gone. Closing of Part 3, by the early 5th century, Alexandria's dream was broken. Caesar's fire had wounded it. The Serapeum's fall had crippled it. Hypatia's murder had silenced it. Yet one more chapter of destruction remained. In the 7th century, a new empire would rise, carrying with it new faith, new rulers, and, if legend is true, the final silence of the library. A new empire rises. By the early 7th century, the ancient world had transformed yet again. Rome had split into East and West. The Western Empire had fallen to Germanic tribes. In the East, Constantinople held firm, but its grip on distant provinces weakened. Into this fractured landscape surged a new power, Islam. From the deserts of Arabia, the followers of the Prophet Muhammad swept outward in a tide of conquest and faith. By 642 CE, just a decade after Muhammad's death, Arab armies marched into Egypt. For centuries, Egypt had been Rome's granary, its breadbasket, its jewel on the Nile. Now it fell into the hands of a new empire, one driven by zeal, guided by revelation, and hungry to expand. And at the heart of Alexandria, still proud, though diminished, stood the echo of the great library, the legend of Caliph Omar. According to some later accounts, when the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria, he wrote to the Caliph Omar in Medina, asking what should be done with the library. The Caliph's reply, as the story goes, was chilling. If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heresy. In either case, destroy them. And so, by this tale, the scrolls of the library were gathered, distributed to the city's bathhouses, and used as fuel to heat water. It is said the supply lasted 6 months. Thus, the final flame. Thus, the last silence. A story or a myth? But historians disagree. The earliest accounts of this story appear centuries after the conquest, written by Christian and Persian chroniclers, often hostile to Islam. Contemporary Muslim sources are silent. Could this be propaganda, blaming Arabs for what was already gone? By the 7th century, the library may have already perished through earlier fires, neglect, and decay. Perhaps what Omar allegedly burned were not vast halls of knowledge, but smaller remnants scattered across the city. The truth is murky, but whether fact or myth, the story persists, because it captures the tragedy of knowledge judged by faith, wisdom reduced to kindling. Mini-story, the bathhouses of Alexandria. Imagine the bathhouses of Alexandria in that year. Citizens entering to wash themselves, the air thick with steam, the fires stoked not with wood, but with papyrus. Scrolls, centuries old, filled with the voices of Aristotle, Herophilos, or lost prophets, fed into furnaces, each bath a funeral pyre, each bucket of hot water a small grave for human memory. Whether literal or symbolic, the image remains one of the most haunting in history. The broader context. Even if the tale of Omar's edict is apocryphal, the conquest of Alexandria marked a real shift. Religious transition. Islam became the dominant faith in Egypt, shaping its future for centuries. Cultural change. Arabic replaced Greek as the language of learning. Scrolls and manuscripts not translated were left to rot. Knowledge transfer. Some works were preserved, translated into Arabic, carried into the Islamic Golden Age. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, 8th to 13th centuries, became a new Alexandria of sorts, where Greek, Persian, and Indian texts lived again. In this sense, knowledge was not entirely lost. It migrated, transformed, survived in fragments. Yet the dream of universality, the idea of everything in one place, was gone forever. The slow decay theory. Modern historians increasingly believe the library did not end in one dramatic blaze, but in a slow unraveling. Caesar's fire may have destroyed warehouses. The Serapeum's fall scattered what was left. Centuries of neglect, war, and changing rulers eroded the rest. By 642 CE, there may have been little left to burn. This view is less romantic, but more realistic. Knowledge, like empires, does not always end in fire. Sometimes it fades page by page, scroll by scroll, until silence is all that remains. Mini-story, the hidden survivors. Though Alexandria's scrolls vanished, echoes lived on. Greek works copied into Byzantine libraries. Medical texts carried east into Syriac and Arabic translations. Philosophical fragments preserved in monasteries. In this way, the library was both lost and not lost. Its body was gone, but its spirit, scattered like ashes on the wind, helped ignite later renaissances. Without these fragments, the Islamic Golden Age, the European Renaissance, and the Scientific Revolution might never have come. The tragedy is not that we lost everything, but that we lost so much more than survived. The symbol of Omar's edict. Whether true or false, the story of Omar's command endures because it represents something larger, the conflict between knowledge and power, between curiosity and dogma. In every age, rulers face the choice: preserve knowledge or destroy it, encourage inquiry or silence it. The library's fate, whoever lit the final flame, shows how fragile that choice is. And so, by the 7th century, the dream was over. The library that once sought to gather all the wisdom of the world was gone, whether in Caesar's fire, Theodosius' edict, Omar's command, or simply the quiet decay of centuries. What remained was a legend, a ghost story whispered by historians, poets, and dreamers. A story not just of loss, but of longing for a world where memory is eternal, where no voice is silenced, where wisdom is never burned. Yet, in imagining its death, we also imagine its survival. And that is where the greatest what if begins. Not one fire, but many. When people imagine the Library of Alexandria, they often picture one single night of flames, scrolls collapsing into ash, and centuries of wisdom lost in an instant. It is a powerful image, but perhaps an oversimplification. Modern historians argue that the library did not perish in one blaze, but in a long, drawn-out decline. It was not murdered in a moment, but bled over centuries. Caesar's fire, 48 BCE. Perhaps the first wound, consuming warehouses of scrolls. The Serapeum's fall, 391 CE, a deliberate act of religious violence, scattering a vast collection. The Arab conquest, 642 CE, possibly the final silence, or perhaps the burning of mere remnants. Time itself. Scrolls of papyrus decay quickly without constant copying. Neglect is as deadly as fire. The library's tragedy may not be one great catastrophe, but a series of smaller ones, each erasing a little more until nothing was left. The fragility of papyrus. Papyrus was the lifeblood of Alexandria, but also its weakness. Unlike parchment, papyrus is fragile. It frays in humidity, molds in damp, and disintegrates with age. Without scribes constantly recopying, even the greatest texts dissolve into dust. This means that even without fire or conquest, scrolls would have faded. The library's survival depended on sustained funding, careful preservation, and constant copying. As dynasties changed, as priorities shifted, the commitment may have wavered. Knowledge is eternal only if guarded. The library was not. The weight of politics. The library lived at the mercy of kings and emperors. The Ptolemies nurtured it, but Rome tolerated it only as long as it was useful. When religion took over empire, the library's association with paganism made it a target. Later conquerors, whether Christian or Muslim, saw it not as a treasure, but as a threat. This is the danger of knowledge tied to power. When rulers change, wisdom becomes vulnerable. Mini story. The silent scribes. Picture a scribe in the late years of Alexandria. The halls are quieter now. Fewer scrolls arrive from ships. Funding is thin. He copies as best he can, but he cannot keep up. Dust gathers on shelves. Scrolls crumble when touched. He knows the dream is fading, but still he works. Line by line, he preserves what he can, unaware that centuries later, scholars will wonder why so much was lost. He is the last defender of memory, fighting not fire, but time. The slow death as the greater tragedy. A single fire is dramatic, but a slow death is more tragic. It means humanity had chance after chance to save the library and failed. When Caesar's fire struck, the Ptolemies could have rebuilt with vigor. When Theodosius banned paganism, scholars could have hidden scrolls more widely. When Arabs conquered, more might have been translated. Each generation had an opportunity to preserve memory. Each failed in whole or in part. The library did not just burn, it was abandoned. The myth larger than reality. Perhaps the library never held as much as legend claims. Perhaps its 400,000 scrolls were closer to 40,000. Perhaps not every lost gospel, not every map of new worlds truly lay on its shelves. And yet, the myth persists. Why? Because it represents not just one building, but an idea that all human knowledge can be gathered, preserved, and shared. The tragedy is not the loss of a building, it is the loss of that dream. Mini story, a glimpse in Baghdad. Centuries later, during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad created the House of Wisdom, a vast library and translation center. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese works were gathered, studied, and expanded. Some whispered it was a rebirth of Alexandria, its lost fragments resurrected. Perhaps a handful of texts that once sat in the Serapeum lived again in Arabic translation. But even the House of Wisdom eventually fell to Mongol flames in 1258, when the Tigris River is said to have run black with ink. History repeated itself. The dream is eternal, the destruction recurring. The lesson of the library. What do we learn from Alexandria's long death? Knowledge must be preserved in many places. A single library, no matter how great, is too fragile. Knowledge must be valued beyond power. If wisdom is tied to kings or churches, it will fall with them. Knowledge must be shared. The dream of universality requires openness, not secrecy. The library fell because it was too central, too dependent, too vulnerable. The eternal what if. And so we return to the haunting question, what if the library had survived? Would we have cured diseases earlier, explored the stars sooner, avoided centuries of darkness and ignorance? Or was the destruction inevitable? Humanity not yet ready to bear the weight of such knowledge. The truth lies beyond reach. But the what if lingers, a shadow stretching from antiquity to our own digital age. The library as warning today. We imagine ourselves safe. We have the internet, satellites, backups. Knowledge seems invincible. But the story of Alexandria warns us nothing is permanent. A cyber attack, a power failure, a war, or even simple neglect could erase what we take for granted. The library whispers across time, protect memory or lose it. The Library of Alexandria did not die in one night, but in many, burned by generals, dismantled by zealots, eroded by neglect, and consumed by time. It represents the fragility of human progress. It is a tragedy we cannot undo, but also a lesson we cannot ignore. For every book, every archive, every database we protect today, we keep alive the dream of Alexandria, the dream that no voice, no idea, no truth should ever be lost again. With this, the story of destruction ends. We have traced the library's rise, its scars under Caesar, its fall under Theodosius, its silence under Omar, or perhaps its slow fading across centuries. Now, in Chapter 3, we turn fully to speculation, the alternate history, a world where Alexandria's scrolls survived, a world where humanity leapt forward centuries, where empires rose differently, where faith and science walked hand in hand. The what if begins.